genealogy, but on this speech, on this night, I talk about DNA and Jewish genealogy. I've been interested in genealogy since I was a boy. In 1965, 2 months before my bar mitzvah, my grandmother died. We went to the cemetery for the burial, and at the end of the ceremony, my father took my hand and led me off into the cemetery in one direction. My mother took my brother's hand and led him off in a different direction. And I grew up without any first cousins living in my hometown, with just one grandparent in my hometown. And I found out at the end of that burial ceremony that I had lots of relatives in Omaha, Nebraska, except that all of them were in the cemetery. And I had lots of relatives in Omaha, Nebraska. We've had relatives. My parents were both born in Omaha, Nebraska. I have one grandparent that was born in the United States. Most of the relatives came to this little place, the shtetl in the middle of American Siberia in the 1890s and early 1900s. So I had a lot of relatives there, but I didn't have a lot of close relatives. And as I said, I didn't have many relatives who were alive. Well, that evening, when everyone came to the house, I was the little kid, just, almost 13 years old, and I was walking around all the relatives asking them, where did their parents, where did their grandparents come from? Tell me about your parents and your grandparents and your uncles and aunts, and who do you remember? And so I drew my first family tree that night in 1965, and since that time I've picked up and put down and picked up and put down my genealogy many times over the next 20 or 30 years. And ultimately, I've always put it down because I hit a paper trail roadblock. So what we're going to talk about tonight is my personal discovery, what one can do with DNA. DNA, think of it this way. DNA is the history book that's written into all of your cells, and only now, in the beginning of the 21st century, is science learning how to read that history book. Now, we also have a medical book written into our cells. We even know less about that than we do about the history book that's written into our cells. But certainly over the next few generations, all of that is going to be decoded, or it's going to be more decoded. And that's the promise of personal medicine and yourself. What we're talking about is personalizing your DNA and your personal story, because everyone here is different. Every man in this room has a different origin. Unless you know that you're related, you have a different origin. The men probably hail back from the Levant, probably from the Middle East. On our mother's side, only about half of us actually descend from a woman who left Judea 2,000 years ago in the diaspora following our unfortunate loss to the Roman Empire. So let me go through this with you. Traditional genetic genealogy focused on the direct male line. It's the Y chromosome that goes from a man to his son. The son passes it on to his son, and that son passes it on to his son. And so the Y chromosome does not recombine with anything. Therefore, every one of the men in this room who have a brother, they have a brother who has a Y chromosome that's the same. The reason it's the same is that you both got it from your fathers. That means that a male cousin of yours on your father's side should have identical or near identical DNA as you do. So we don't dig up anybody or any of this silly stuff that that people might theorize when we're doing genetic genealogy. If 6 generations ago your father's 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 father was a famous rabbi, then he passed his Y chromosome to his son, who passed it 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 to you. And therefore, I could get the Y chromosome of your great-great-great-great-grandfather by testing. I can get this man's Y chromosome by testing you today, or by testing your father, or by testing your brother. Women, I can test your brothers and obtain that same piece of information. It also goes through on the direct female line. Everyone has mitochondria, which comes from their mom. Men and women both have mitochondria coming from the mother. So my sister, if I had a sister, and I would have had the same mitochondria from my mom, who would have gotten it from her mom, who got it from her mom, who got it from her mom, and that excludes everyone else in the center. We'll talk about them in a little while. That's what you could have gotten from genetic genealogy in the year 2000 when I had my eureka moment and was trying to see if someone whose name was Nitz, which was the same name as my mother's father, although they were living, this other Nitz family was living in Buenos Aires, and all I wanted to do was to find out if we were actually related to those folks in Buenos Aires. Direct male line, direct female line. So, as I said, traditional genetic genealogy focuses in effect on the sex genes, the Y chromosome, and then let's just call the mitochondria a sex gene, although technically it's certainly not on the autosomal DNA. I'll explain autosomal in a few minutes. Males receive that Y chromosome from their dads. Males receive mitochondria from their mothers. Women only receive mitochondria from their mothers. And that's why whenever you're trying to do a surname study or you're trying to trace back, let's say your name is Teitelbaum and you come from Minsk and there's another Teitelbaum and his family came from Pinsk. If you want to know if you are related to them, each one of those men need to take a Y DNA test, and either their Y chromosome will match, they're related, or it doesn't match, they're not related. Genetic genealogy is guilt by association. If you're Jewish and your Y chromosome is Jewish, in other words, if your father came from a Jewish genetic gene pool, guys, and you test with us, you're going to match Jewish guys. You might match some other guys who aren't Jewish, but what you'll find out is that they're adopted, and they didn't know. They may be related 2 or 4 or 6 generations ago, but they came from a Jewish genetic gene pool. You are not at all likely to match someone who's Irish if your ancestry is typically Jewish. Irish people match Irish people, Jewish people match Jewish people. And occasionally we may match an Arab or two because, frankly, they're cousins, even though we have a little conflict with them, over Israel. We are genetically related to them, despite what some of them may say from time to time. Even if you don't know what your heritage is, you can find out what your heritage is, especially important for adopted folks. You can learn about your recent ancestry, which we refer to as genealogy, and you can learn about your deeper anthropology, okay, which your deeper ancestry, which we call anthropology. Now, the first case study of DNA ever was done by a team from the University of Arizona and from University College London, and that's exactly it. They did the Kohanim study that you may have heard about. They studied this starting in 1996, published in 1997, and found that when they tested 150 men who were Ashkenazim, who claimed to be Kohanim, that almost 50% of those men had the same Y chromosome, meaning that almost 50% of those men were related to one another. And then they did the same test on 150 Sephardic males. They found that 56% of those men fell into this cluster. In other words, they matched each other, and when they laid the Sephardic cluster over the Ashkenazi cluster, it was the same cluster. In other words, the most common DNA signature among Ashkenazim, who claimed to be Kohanim, was the same DNA signature among Sephardim, who had the same claim. Very, very interesting fact. Now, in the center of the cell are all of your chromosomes, your 23 chromosomes. Outside of the center of the cell, you have what's called mitochondria. The mitochondria is that energy pack of the cell. It's what gives you your get up and go. It's what gives you energy. It's what powers the cell. And that's what's passed on from a mother to all of her children. The girls then pass it on to the next generation. So men, you have a Y chromosome. You also have your mom's mitochondria, but when you have children, you will not pass that on to the next generation. That's always the mom's job. So when I first had this eureka moment and realized that there had been this study in 1997 and I might be able to use the male inherited Y chromosome to prove that these folks in Argentina were related to my cousins out in California, I needed to do a little study. And so what I found is that the Y chromosome, which is the smallest of our 23 chromosomes, is passed on and has nothing to recombine with, whereas the autosomes, the 22 other chromosomes, recombine in every generation, kind of like taking a red deck of cards and a blue deck of cards and shuffling them once, with the red deck of cards representing your mom's DNA, the blue deck representing your dad's DNA. You shuffle it once and you are that shuffled deck. Part red, part blue, part mom, part dad. Okay, but for genetic genealogy, we focused right here just with the Y chromosome, which made it very, very easy because there was no recombination. Whatever the dad had, he passed on to the next generation. Now, let's take a look at what someone gets when they do a DNA test. They get a series of numbers. It could not be more confusing in that respect. This DYS right here stands for designated Y chromosome segment. It's a little location that is on every Y chromosome. Every man has a number that the scientists call 393. What's different is how many repeats of ACG, ACG, ACG someone has at that location. I have a 12 at that location because my dad had a 12 at that location. He passed on the 12 to me, passed on his 23, passed on his 14. If I was an Irishman, I would be 13, 24, 14, 11. But I'm a Semite. Therefore, I am 12, 23, 14, 10. And anyone that has an exact signature like this is a relative of mine. No matter what their name is, no matter what their religion is, no matter where they're living in the world, they're related to me on the male side. So let's see how that plays out. Well, first let me show you a little bit about copying errors on the Y chromosome. Let's take a theoretical dad right here. We'll call him the grandfather. Let's say he had two sons. This son is perfectly gray like the grandfather, which means that there's no difference between the grandfather and this son. But this son has a little orange mark down here, which signifies that he got a mutation from his father. He was passed on a copying error. Either 12 repeats of ACG became 13 repeats, he gained a repeat, or he went down to 11, he lost a repeat. So that's what makes this son different from this son. Now, that would be represented by this orange mark right here. This man has a son. He has a mutation at the same location. So these two men both have a 14, whereas they received they had a 15. The dad had a 15, but one of the sons ended up with a 14. And now this man had a son who's identical to him, identical to the granddad, but he had another son who had a novel or a different mutation that would be expressed right here. And now it's time for true confessions. That's my dad. It's my brother. That's me. Okay, and since the time that this mutation has been discovered, my brother refers to me as the mutant in the family. Now, when you get your results, you can't just look at those numbers. What you want to really do is you want to look at who you match, who has the same DNA signature as you do. Because if you have someone that you match, it means you're related to them. How long in time are you related to them is kind of dependent on whether you match exactly or whether there is one mutational difference between the two of you, or two mutational differences, or three mutational differences. And as you can imagine, the less mutational differences, the more recently you're related. I mean, once you get it, it makes a lot of sense. It's very, very easy. So you can look here. My last name is Greenspan, and I have one looking at 67 different distinct locations on my Y chromosome. I have one person who's identical to me. And the really good news between myself and my wife is that that's my son. Okay, so you know there's been no hanky-panky. I mean, this really is my son. Now, in our family, my daughter used to bust my son's chops, so to speak, and she actually, got mad at him one day and said, you're adopted. You're really not. You're adopted. And he was so proud, so pleased when these DNA results came back that showed that he and his father matched exactly. He was able to go up to her and say, "Ha! See this? I'm not adopted. I am Dad's son. Are you Dad's daughter?" So he kind of turned it around. Now, interestingly, not only do I match my son, as I said, great news, but I am almost a perfect match to a man named Gransel, Braverman, Zaloff, Gelfand, and they're one mutation away. My brother, Jim Greenspan, my father, Bud Greenspan, a Russian guy, a Dr. Penson, a Dr. Paulson. Now I'm getting out 5 mutations. 4 or 5 mutations, which means related, but related a long time ago. I match a guy named Ludwig Mossberg, a guy named Guillermo Carrasco, and another man named Manuel Tenorio, and we'll talk about those guys again in just a minute. So in our system, you also get to see your ancestral origins, which shows you where people with the same DNA signature as you are actually from. And so all the normal places, I mean, if I asked you to raise your hands where your father's father's father came from, I'd probably get one of you who said Belarus and one who would say Lithuania, and somebody would say Poland, and somebody would say Russia, because if you're Eastern Europe, those were our stomping grounds, so to speak. When I start getting a few copying error or mutations away from my DNA signature, got a guy in Belarus and a guy in Latvia, and I get 5 mutations away, and I have someone in the Ukraine, and I've got 2 guys who claim they came from Spain. So let's just think in a moment, or for a moment, what that's all about. Going again 6 steps away, Hungary, Romania, and Spain again. So this is our family tree DNA time prediction calculator, which calculates how long ago someone who matches you, either exactly or kind of matches you, likely would have shared a common ancestor. And so comparing myself with Manuel Tenorio, it says that there's about a 98% chance that he and I shared a common male ancestor, but that was 600 years ago. So 600 years from my birth, which was 1952, puts our common ancestor back, maybe in Spain, in 1352. So what was happening in Spain in the 1300s? Well, that was 40 years before the anti-Jewish riot started in 1391, I believe. It was 500 years from the time of the Inquisition, where people who wanted to remain as Jews fled Spain in a 90-day period of time, and those who, for one reason or another, couldn't leave or chose not to leave and converted and became Catholic and forgot, maybe immediately, and it might have been 100 or 200 years later, but they forgot that they were of Jewish origin. Well, those folks stayed in Spain. And so what that tells me is that my father's direct male line, even though we know of it as an Eastern European Jewish line, really is a Spanish Inquisition, Spanish diaspora Jewish lineage. And that was a shock. I couldn't determine that by looking in a mirror. There was no history book that said it. In fact, there aren't even any history books that claim that there were real substantive migrations of Jews from Spain to Eastern Europe. But someone in the genealogy community came to me one day and they said, "We're starting to see matches with Hispanic Catholics." And I said, "This is poppycock. I don't believe it." start a group, a study group to study this. And I said, okay, you can start the group. Well, about a year later, I matched Manuel Tenorio. And so I had to call up and eat my hat and tell them that, now that it's affected me, I guess you're right. And so I was a little embarrassed, but it's always important when you make a foul that you raise your hand real high and say, I was wrong. And so now I understand that many Ashkenazi Jews must have moved from Spain to Bulgaria or Turkey and then moved northward into Eastern Europe, abandoned the Sephardic style of the bima in the center, adopted the Ashkenazi style of the bima in the front of the room, and in effect acculturated as Ashkenazim, even though 600 years ago a lot of us were actually living in Spain. So this will give you kind of a compare and contrast. I'm going to flip back 2 or 3 times on this. You can see that this is Sephardim by branches of the tree of mankind. Branch of the tree of mankind, that's where the word haplogroup falls into play. It's a phylogeny. Every species has its evolutionary path, its copying error path. So there are about 18 branches of the tree of mankind, and you find Jews coming from the E branch, which is North African, the J1 and J2 branch, which is most commonly found in Iran, Iraq, Syria, among Palestinians, among Saudi Arabians, and it's also the most common branch of the tree that Jews are found. So this poppycock that Jews are not historically from the Middle East, absolutely not true. Here's a Q branch. It only represents about 2% of Jews. Probably they got on the bus later. Here's an R1b branch. And even though R1b is typically found in Western Europe, there is a Middle Eastern branch, and about half of the Ashkenazi and about half of the Sephardic Jews who are from this particular branch are from that hails from the Middle East branch. So historically, those folks were living in the Middle East and were probably dispersed by the Romans. And then you've got a G branch, a K branch, and an I branch. Effectively the same thing. If you look back and forth, I know the circles are not in the exact same place, but if you look at the percentages are almost the same with the exception of this one. J2, which is a Middle Eastern branch, happens to be at a much elevated or higher percentage in Sephardic Jews than Ashkenazi Jews. That's probably because of something that we call genetic drift or founder effect. In other words, just so happened that 10 Jews who formed a community, it just happened that 3 or 4 or 5 of them were from that Middle Eastern branch by the luck of the draw. Okay, there's also mtDNA. What can we find from mtDNA? Well, again, these are my matches in mtDNA. I match a woman named Rubinson. I match a man named Chernoff. And then I match a man named Balshan. The interesting thing is that Mr. Balshan, that his family left Morocco in 1949 and moved to Israel. And so he is, again, a Sephardic Jew. And so I matched 2 Sephardic Jews and 2 Ashkenazi Jews and 1 Sephardic Jew. And so it's been joked within the family that I have enough Sephardic background to think about eating rice on Pesach. Now, all of us have migrated since the dawn of mankind, since that theoretical Adam or genetic Adam and genetic Eve. The difference that science has with the Torah is that science would put that Garden of Eden somewhere here in Africa rather than in the Middle East. But beyond that, the stories mesh pretty nicely. People were in Africa, some people left Africa. We believe the people who left Africa took 2 paths. One was around the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and then all the way to Australia. The other one forged up through the Middle East and then from the Middle East went on into Europe and into Asia. Now we're going to do a couple case studies. I hope you'll appreciate these. I got a phone call one day from a fellow whose name was Goodlove. He was doing a DNA test and wanted to determine if he was related to a guy that he knew whose name was Godlove. He said, look, it's only one O. I think I must be related to these guys. So they took a DNA test, and the fact is that he did match this other Godlove guy, but that wasn't the real astounding thing. He's an Iowa farmer who had a Bible that went back to 1783 showing that they were Lutheran, but he had all these matches with people in our database that said Ashkenazim. Can you imagine this salt of the earth Iowa farmer's shock when he got his DNA results? And it's the symbol of the Kohanim that he has on his page because his DNA matched that 1997 study that we talked about earlier. And you can see Ashkenazi Kohanim, Ashkenazi Kohanim, Ashkenazi, and even a Sephardic Jew from the island of Rhodes. Absolutely shocked to this guy. So he was, as I say, he was pretty shocked. Got off the phone, called me back 3 days later and said, I figured it out. And I said, well, what did you figure out? He said, I figured out what our name used to be. I said, what was that? He said, I'm now convinced that our name was Gottlieb. And I want to start a DNA surname project with your company under the name of Gottlieb. And generally, I don't allow the Gentiles to run a Jewish name project. I think that Irish should run Irish projects and we should run our own projects. But I let him go ahead and do it. Within inside of 6 months, he was out recruiting men named Gottlieb. He found a Jewish guy named Gottlieb that matched this Goodlove and Godlove's DNA signature. And so he doesn't know why the family converted, but he knows that they did convert. And that's an interesting fact. Now, there was a woman named Berta Sanchez. She was born in Spain into a Catholic family, but they had an oral tradition that 500 years after the Inquisition that they were of Jewish ancestry on her mother's line. So she wanted to test. She was unable to prove anything using conventional genealogy, and certainly the rabbis didn't care about what she had to say because it was based on some genealogy that may or may not have been submitted into the Catholic Church in Spain, but she believed that she was of Jewish ancestry. So she took a DNA test, and when she got her results back, she matched no one in our database that was Jewish. In other words, none of the Ashkenazim in our database did she match. She didn't match anyone in our database that was non-Jewish. She didn't match anybody. So I opened up an unpublished spreadsheet from Dr. Doron Bahar, who's a researcher at Rambam in Haifa, and I looked, and since that time I've added them to our database, matched. Here's a Sephardic Jew from Algeria. Here is another Sephardic Jew from Algeria, a Sephardic Jew from Bulgaria, and 5 Sephardic Jews from Turkey, all living in Israel, all the samples collected in Israel. That's all the matches that she had at that time. Since that time, she's picked up 3 more matches, 1 from Germany and 3 from Spain. So this was pretty shocking. It was pretty impressive, what we were actually able to show. And so I wrote a letter to a Bet Din and explained just what I've said to you. She's from a Catholic family, from everything, that I've been told. She matches no one in our database other than 10 Jews from Algeria, Bulgaria, and Turkey. And she was issued what's called a letter of return, which means you have to go through a conversion process, but we understand that something happened in your family. It's like a symbolic recognition that you were given a choice of convert or die, because who knew what her family's situation was in those 91 days that Jews had to leave Spain. Maybe grandmama would have died on the trip, maybe that someone was pregnant, having a hard pregnancy. Whatever reason, the family chose at that point to stay in Spain. But it's very interesting, and I have run into many, many people who have been in a similar situation. I had one fellow from Peru who contacted us, had matches to Sephardic and Ashkenazi people, didn't really understand it. I wrote him back and said, my experience is that if your family came to the New World before 1550, you knew that you were Jewish. And if you came, and you may have been Jewish when you came, and you may have been a crypto-Jew, if you came before 1600, you still remembered, it was only 4 generations since the Inquisition, you still remembered that you were Jewish. You may or may not have been Jewish. And if you came after 1600 or after 1650, 1700, you probably didn't even know that you were of Jewish ancestry. The guy wrote back and said, our family came in 1548. So I wrote him back and said, how does this make you feel? And he said, my whole life I've been Catholic, never really thought about being anything else. I don't know how I feel. And so I haven't had contact with him since that time. There's this other fellow named Guillermo Carrasco, who I mentioned earlier. When you look at his results, his matches, exact matches, Belarus, Latvia, Poland, Russia, and Spain. And again, Belarus, Bulgaria, Russia, Austria, Hungary, Lithuania, Poland, etc., etc. This guy was absolutely shocked. His family left Spain 110 years ago for Chile, and then about 50 years ago, he left Chile and came to the United States, and was absolutely astounded when he found that he had Jewish ancestry. Wasn't disappointed, just astounded. This shows where his family was from in Spain, and this shows all of his matches. So you can see the Eastern European Jews and the one Spanish match. And when you look at Manuel Tenorio, his family was involved in the Reconquista of New Mexico in 1681. And who were his matches? Chavez, Tenorio, Gans, Roost, Carrasco, Hollerman, and you can probably tell which are the Jewish names and which are not. You come down here, Chavez, Tenorio, you come a little farther, Zaloff, Passy, who's from Fez in Morocco, Carrasco, and then you come down to the bottom, Bennett Greenspan, Elliot Daniel Greenspan. These are the guys that I'm matching, and it's so it's kind of interesting for all of us. Now, here's one for you. There's this woman from Puerto Rico who came to us, and I'll share her email. It said the following: my grandmother is the last of the line that carries the surname. They apparently were not religious, but made the claim of their heritage. I don't know why else would want to when the whole world seems to demonize us at every junction in history. My mother continues to carry on the spoken tradition that we are Jewish, and I grew up all my life with a menorah and a mezuzah, but we did not mix religiously as Jews. I now have 5 children and cannot rest, nor do I have peace until I know if this claim is true. I understand that they may have converted secretly and the bloodline may not reveal that religious conversion, but they claim we are descendants of Jews. It truly disquiets my spirit, not knowing or being able to locate the origin of our surname. If I am a Jew beyond the shadow of a doubt, then I want to be counted as one, not just from the oral tradition. If I am a Jew, then I want to live as one. I want to stand in the face of the world and say, Hineni, here I am, I stand before you, the one you tried to wipe off the face of the earth, and look, I now have 5 children to carry this blood for generations until the end of time and until the end of days. And I receive emails like this, similar, monthly. I run the Semitic desk, which means I deal with all the Jews, I deal with all the crypto-Jews, I deal with all the Meshuggah, I deal with all the Jews for Jesus, and I deal with all the Arabs. And so, it's a very interesting dynamic. Today, I just had an email from a girl who who doesn't know anything about her mom. Her father was Saudi Arabian, and she wanted to know if she was an Ashkenazi. And so I wrote her back and I said, no, you clearly don't match anyone, but your DNA is Middle Eastern, and maybe you match a Mizrahi Jew that we've never tested, because we haven't tested a lot of Mizrahi Jews. And I have a number also of Arabs who we've tested who were Palestinian by birth, but that have kind of started to think that maybe those Palestinian ancestors were Jews before they became, Muslims. And there is a fellow named Sinai who's been traveling around Israel talking to villagers on the West Bank who have said that we know that we were Jews before we became Muslims, 2 generations, 4 generations, 6 generations ago. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic. Let's move on. We have a new test that we introduced a couple of years ago. It's called the Family Finder. We have already looked at this chart. In 2001, you had the direct male line, you had the direct female line, but now, with autosomal DNA, which is where we recombine the red and the blue decks, you now can find chunks of DNA in you that come from all of your 16 great-great-grandparents. So whereas in the past, you had to have a direct father's line or mother's line, which is why I had to reach out to a cousin of mine in California who was a NITS male and convince him to do a DNA test in 1999 so we could prove or disprove whether we were related to these folks in Argentina. Now, with this test, I could have done the test and I wouldn't have had to beg my cousin in California to do a DNA test that he didn't want to do in the first place. So what's special about Family Finder? Well, you can find relatives across all lines, as I just said. You can determine the degree of relationship. First cousins have about a quarter of DNA in common with you. Second cousins have about half that amount of DNA in common with you. And third cousins have another 1/2 or 1/4 of the amount of DNA that a first cousin would have. And so it's kind of mathematical. So by using that, we can predict if 2 people are first cousins, second cousins, third cousins. We can also prove if someone is a half sibling or a full sibling. And for adoptees, we can actually match them up against our database, and sometimes we can show them that they are, in fact, that they have a half sibling in our database. And by the way, this thing about anonymous sperm donor, it's an oxymoron. It's kind of like jumbo shrimp. It's like, I don't know, some people would say military intelligence. Everyone in the room who's got kids or grandkids or is going to have, give them the $20. Don't let them, make a DNA deposit at a sperm clinic, because we're now finding people, doctors, who did that 20 and 30 years ago who have tested with us, and now their kids that they never knew about are testing with us, and it's, they're finding matches that they never expected to have. And so the idea of anonymous sperm donor, I would say at this point, is probably an oxymoron. You can find half-siblings. You can make contact with those matches, so to speak. You can reach out and touch someone. It's the perfect test for adoptees because it's gender agnostic rather than gender specific. Now, here is a list. Again, this is me. These are my cousins. This is my cousin Harvey Weisblatt. We predicted him as a second cousin. He actually is a second cousin. Here's Herb Givat. We predicted him as between a first and third cousin. Our best guess was second. He is a second cousin. Here's another one, Nancy Wetzler. She's a second cousin. Actually, She is a second cousin. Here's Ricky Pesner. He's a second cousin. He's actually a second cousin once removed. And so you see, it actually can work. We also allow you to see where you have matching chunks of DNA on a chromosome browser. So anywhere that the two colors match, those are chunks of DNA that these people receive from a common male or female ancestor some generations back. Now all these three are known, this first one and the third one are known relatives in the United States. The second one, this blue one, we didn't know that she was related other than the fact that she is from the Nitz family in Argentina, which ultimately we proved with the Y chromosome was related to us. And you can see that she's matching up against orange, and here she's matching against green, and those are the only two chunks that after all of these years are still in common between them. We give you a place where you can put notes. We also have a percentage test. The percentage test can tell you what percentage of your ancestry is sub-Saharan African or Native American. We can also tell you what percentage of your DNA matches Ashkenazi or Sephardic Jews, although for some demographic reasons that's much, much more challenging. This guy was 49% African, 46% European, and about 4% South Asian. So you got an idea of what this guy looks like, okay, just because I've given you his genetic percentages. And so this is who it is. This is Henry Louis Gates. You can barely see him there, but Henry Gates did those PBS television shows, and so he's kind of a famous guy, certainly. I mean, certainly not just in his own mind, but he's kind of a famous guy as it is. And all it takes is a swab. You just take a swab, you scrape the inside of your mouth, it breaks off some epithelial cells, then you eject the tip into our test tube and mail it back to us. This is an example. We're not going to be able to see the photos because of the lights, but this is, it shows her scraping, and here it shows her ejecting into the tube. There's a right way to scrape. We had a guy once who failed his scraping twice. He called us. He was quite frustrated, and he said, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I followed your instructions. I scraped the outside of my cheek just like you said. And we said, no, you don't scrape the outside of your cheek. You scrape the inside of your cheek. And so he said, well, do you want me to scrape the inside of the outside of my cheek or the outside of the inside of my cheek? Tell you how embarrassed he was. And we said, frankly, we don't care. Just scrape, open your mouth and scrape. Pretend like you're brushing your teeth and turn the brush backwards. And so we had a cartoonist. You saw the first cartoon, perhaps, earlier that said Bennett sure likes those genetic markers, picture of a little kid drawing on the walls. Well, he drew that, and he said, look, I want a DNA test, but let me draw you some cartoon. You'll get a little humor out of it. So he did. Here's a picture of the guy. He says, doctor, I'm having a little difficulty with my cheek scraping. He's got his family tree DNA kit. He's got his instructions here, and he's got his scraper right there. And so, just a little humor for the evening. A couple of company milestones before I end and open it up to any questions that you might have. We've sold 272,000 DNA test kits to people of all colors and populations and religions all around the world since we started the company in 2000. The National Geographic Society came to us in 2004 and said, we like what you're doing. We think we can market the idea better than you guys. We want to license your product. We have 249,000 male DNA samples in our database, 155,000 female samples, and since the inception of that National Geographic project, they have sold and we have processed 585,000 individuals. And how do you order? We have these little simple order forms. You can you just fill out your name and your address, and we mail you kits. You can get a mail test. We look at typically 37 locations on the Y chromosome. We look at the mitochondria, or we look at what's called the family finder, which is that autosomal DNA test, and whenever we do speaking engagements, we always offer some discounted pricing to kind of encourage people to get with the program, because I can't match up to the Gentiles and show them that they come from our glorious group unless I have y'all in the database. So I had a fellow who came to us once, and he said, I have a weird story about my mother. She has a birth certificate that says that was issued in 1947 in Poland, but she was like 6 years old then. And it seems weird. And someone said that she was given up for adoption at a train station in Rozwadów, Poland in May of 1941. So can you tell me if I have Jewish ancestry? And I said, I can look at your mom's DNA, your mitochondria, and I can tell you whether it matches Jewish people or non-Jewish people. And he said, I'd like to do that. And so Cesare Udali, presently a lawyer in Ottawa, Canada, did a DNA test, and his mother matched someone named, one person in our database named, and this was years ago, named Gerson Kappa. And since that time, he's matched lots of Jews on his mother's side, and he never would have known that he had Jewish ancestry for sure if he wouldn't have been able to take a DNA test and match with other Jews who had already submitted a DNA test. So, it's really the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the kind of things that we're able to prove to people, as I've illustrated, or hopefully illustrated tonight, can be kind of shocking. What I see for us out of it, since most of these people don't decide that they want to become Jewish, invariably, I believe that when someone finds that they are of Jewish ancestry, if they're at the water cooler and they hear someone making a joke about Jews, they are a lot more likely to say, hey, I have Jewish ancestry, don't say that. And in my opinion, that's a victory. And so that's why I love what I do, and why I travel all around the country and leave home a lot for the opportunity to speak, because I am an evangelist for genetic genealogy, more so for Jewish genetic genealogy than anything else. And darn near my favorite slide, a woman who doesn't look anything like my wife saying to a guy who kind of looks a little bit more like me these days, you don't look anything like the long-haired, skinny kid I married 25 years ago. I need a DNA test to make sure it's still you. And then I received this next picture sent to me from someone in Sarasota, Florida a few months ago. The guy's got his heart in the right place, I suppose. You can't see it. It's a guy who says, need money for DNA test, girlfriend might be sister. And so, the things that people send me, I don't know whether this is real or not. He kind of looks like a panhandler, so it might be real. But at any rate, with that, I thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those for you now.
Is there any questions?
Yes, sir. Quick question. You were talking earlier about the Kohanim gene, and you were talking about 50% only match that. So what happens to the other 50%? Are they or are they not?
Well, okay, so I'm not in the religion business. I'm in the interpretation of DNA business. There are 5 lineages of Jewish males who claim by oral tradition to be Kohanim. There's a group that has about 50% of all the claimants fall into one group, and then in these other 4 groups, there are between 5 and 13 or 14%, in each of those. So if you took those 150 men, you've got about 65 fell into one group, and then all the others fall in kind of neatly to these other 4 groups. Now, if you've ever read The Jewish Wars by Flavius Josephus, you'll note that he said during the latter Temple II period, that the position of Kohen Gadol became corrupted. And he uses as his argument for that the fact that during the Temple 1 period, the Kohen Gadol typically was in his position of power for an average of 30 years. But that in the Temple 2 period, in particular the last 150 years of the Temple 2 period, the position of Kohen Gadol was changing over quite rapidly. And the average period of time was like 3 to 4 years. And so what I believe is that as he has mentioned and as others have speculated, that the position of Kohen Gadol may have morphed or become a purchased position. It's not something that that we necessarily want to scream from the tallest mountaintop, but the truth is the truth. And so I can't say to a person today, you are absolutely positively 100% for sure a descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses. And so when someone comes to me, and we don't sell a Kohen test. I mean, we used to sell a test that was a Kohanim test. We don't sell that test today. And when someone comes to me and I have all those Jewish questions funneled to me, if someone says, I want a Kohanim test, I always turn the question around and ask them, are they Dati? Are they religious? Because if a person is very much personally tied up, who he is, as his identity is tied up in being a Kohanim, then I tell him I don't want him to test. It's not a matter that he can't test, it's that I would prefer that he doesn't test with us. Because all I can do is hurt him. And I would rather never do that. So I'm glad you asked the question. It's given that it's this is an Orthodox shul, I think it's a really appropriate question here, more so than, let's say, at a Reconstructionist synagogue where, being Kohen means absolutely nothing.
Another question, sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
That also test that match, let's say, the Davidic lineage or anything like that?
There are a couple of folks, Moshe Shaltiel, Mitch Dayan are two that come to mind, who claim to be descendants of King David. The problem is that for me to know that Teitelbaum is related to Teitelbaum, they have to have the same Y chromosome. Okay? And if they have the same Y chromosome and the same name, it's pretty much set. Well, of all the men who have claimed that they are direct descendants of King David, none of them have ever matched each other. And so for that reason, I don't know. I mean, I have to presume that during history, when it was advantageous or when someone like Herod was afraid of a person who was descended from King David's lineage, that they were taken care of. Now, in theory, the exarch of the Iraqi community was the titular head of the Iraqi community, and he was supposed to be a descendant of the Davidic family. I've tested a couple of guys who have that claim. Again, they're not matching these other guys who are making the claim. Maybe these folks are descended through a female line for all I know, but I can't find anything to make a proof. So if we could, we certainly would.
Just to follow up to this question, did you test any of the descendants of the Maharala Prague?
Yes, we did. There is a fellow named Herb Buchscher who actually did that testing. He discussed it at the International Association of Jewish Genealogy 2 years ago, and I don't remember what the findings were, but he absolutely tested many claimants of the descendants of the Maharal. And so that is available. I mean, you could send me an email, I could send you Herb's address.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he'd be happy on, because I think they put it to a 20 or 30 page paper, and I'm sure he'd be happy to share that.
I mean, that's for sure, like, I'm just saying, I'm just curious, like, is that for sure, like, a fact? Like, he's the closest or purest he can find?
They did extensive testing, and they worked with, they worked with some, they worked with quite a few people, and these lineages, especially from the famous rabbinic families, are pretty well documented. People know if they have yichus, and so they were out recruiting folks who absolutely believed and had paper to demonstrate that they were descendants from these folks, and they found some results that were interesting. As I recall, since I did the introduction of her before he spoke, they were a little startling, and that's why in our business we say, if you don't want to know the answer, don't ask the question.
Right.
And so that's...
So with this test, go ahead.
What about Levi'im? Is it possible to identify them?
I'm sorry?
What about Levi'im?
What about...
possible to identify them?
And what about Levi'im? Okay, so there was a paper that actually talked about the Levi'im. It's available on our website under the library section, under the Why DNA Papers, that was written by Dr. Bahar in 2006. The interesting thing about the Levi'im is that there is a group of Ashkenazim who claim to be Levis that represents 50% of all the Levi claimants among Ashkenazim, and we're not sure where those guys fit in genetically, but they don't appear to be Semitic. They appear, quite frankly, to be Ukrainian, Far Eastern European. The best fit for an explanation for that is that when the king of Khazaria converted into Judaism, that he may have come in with some kavod. I mean, when you convert the king of a country, it might be hard to say no when he's saying, what's the pecking order in your group? Kohen, Levite, and Shlech, and Israel? Well, I don't want to come in at the bottom of the heap, and we don't exactly know what happened, but that's probably the best guess. Then, beyond that, the other 50% of Levi'im among Ashkenazi and the Levi'im found among the Sephardic and the Mizrahi are actually found within several different branches of the tree. So the question is, how could that be? And the answer to that is that from the tribe of Levi, if you were a girl, okay, you were still a Levite. I mean, you were still from the tribe before the tribes became canonized, before it became set. There were probably daughters of the Levite tribe who married other boys who became known as Levites because they were kind of under that Levite tribe umbrella. And so the history of the Jewish people is not nearly as clean, and all the Kohanes match, all the Levites match, etc., etc. It's not nearly that that easy. And there have been years of research that have been done by molecular anthropologists to try to answer those questions. And what it tells us is that the Jewish people have probably, by looking at the diversity among our DNA, the Jewish people have probably spent a lot of our history proselytizing. I mean, not in the last 1,800 years, thanks to the Roman Empire, which in the 3rd century made it a crime punishable by death for rabbis to convert a Jew's wife. But it's pretty clear, especially when we look at the DNA of Jewish mothers, that when the Romans deported us from Judea in 75 of the Common Era, either one woman didn't come out for every man, or probably the more honest answer to that would be that that Judean women ended up either dying on the trip or marrying Roman soldiers because it was better than being raped by the entire platoon. And so when the Judeans arrived in Rome and subsequently were sold into slavery, there was a shortage of women. We reached out into the local community, converted women into Judaism, and the rest is history. And that's probably the real story. It's like, why are there so many Jews who are from the North African branch? We all know that, that Moses got into trouble because he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a slave. Right? Do I have my history? Okay. So I think that's probably the mildest story. I think what probably also happened is that those Egyptian taskmasters probably raped Hebrew women in the field. And, the Bible says that when we left Egypt, we left as a mixed multitude. What does that mean? It means we took the kids out from those rapes with us. And, and if you were a tribe from the tribe of Levi and you were raped by an Egyptian and the child went out with the Leviim or with the, Judeans or with the tribe of Dan, then that's how the Jewish genetic gene pool increased, not necessarily because we wanted it that way, but that was history. In the same way, I find among Eastern European Jews a branch of the tree at much elevated percentages that's typical of the DNA that we find among Ukrainian Gentiles. Where did that come from? Probably came from both Dan Chelniki and the Chelniki massacres of 1648, 1649. Because, you don't always just kill. As we learned in the Serbian-Croatian War, sometimes you kill and sometimes you just rape. But their idea at that time was to rape those Croatian women so that in the next generation the babies would be half Serb, half Croat. And so, maybe the Egyptians had the same idea.
One more question.
Yes.
I was reading that some research identified where it was a mixture with Scandinavian population. Do you see in your research?
We really don't. We have a Scandinavian group, Finnish and sometimes Swedish, and they formed as a group. They're so interested if they have Jewish ancestry, but I'm going to tell you, I've not ever seen one of those folks who have that oral tradition who match a bunch of Jews. They typically match Finns and Swedes. And so that's kind of an oral story that I found nothing in the way of confirmation. Yes.
Would you find a difference, like, let's say, if you were to test within the Syrian group, let's say Jewish community, and as far as Ashkenazi group, you know how they say the Syrians are very kept into themselves and they don't believe in marrying outside of the community?
It's a big deal in deal. The genesis of the Jewish people is the same. There have been, as I said, because of genetic drift, you might have had the guys who stayed in Damascus or Aleppo. You might have had a few more of the original guys who were J1s than J2s, or E1Bs versus one of the other groups. But by and large, what you can take home is that you can go to any Jewish community in the world and test the men, and 85% of those men will have DNA that is typical of the Middle East, and it will match Jews from our other two branches. And you can also kind of rest with the fact that most of the women from each of those distinct communities will share more in common with the women in that area, but it's a very few women who are the founders. So, for example, there's no branch on the male side in Judaism that we've ever seen that represents more than about 2.5% of Jewish men. But there are 4 lines in Ashkenazim of women that each represent 10% of all Jews. So what that means is that few numbers of relatively few numbers of founding women, and not necessarily from the Levant. By the way, I refer to those as the overachieving Jewish mothers, and then I duck. Okay, you had a question?
Yeah, my wife is the daughter of a male convert.
Your wife is the daughter
male convert.
A man
White
who
chromosome.
converted.
Yes.
Okay.
Traditionally from Italy.
Okay.
So if you would check, let's say my wife has siblings as well, so my kids and their kids, like as you start doing the testing, and I'm not sure if it was Family Finder or not, does that skew the numbers of like when we think it's a second cousin and it proves to be a second cousin? Does that end up throwing off like you know it's the first cousin, but it shows up as a fourth or fifth cousin, or?
The only time you end up skewing the numbers using the autosomal or Family Finder is when you start having, when you have cousins who are marrying cousins. Like if I take a Jewish person, if I take a non-Jewish person from Ireland and they marry a non-Jewish person from Poland, okay? The populations separated by hundreds of miles, not known to have likely, gotten together in the biblical sense, okay, so it's pure Irish Polish. And then I start testing those cousins. I might find that first cousins to those folks might have 800 units of DNA in common. We call them in science centimorgans. If I test two Ashkenazi Jews who are not known to be related, that are first cousins, they're likely to have 850 to 875 centimorgans in common. The reason for that is that at the end of the Black Plague, well, first at the end of the Crusades, when we were target practice for the Christian armies who intended to, practice on us and then do it to the Muslims, and then the Crusaders, after the Crusaders, the Black Plague or the Black Death, by that time there were only about 25,000 Jews in southern Germany and Prague. And from that number, millions of Jews were around by 1939. And so during that time, we swapped DNA back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So all of us in this room who are Ashkenazim share some DNA in common with all of us who are Ashkenazi. And it kind of skews the chart, so to speak, and we've actually had to create a special filter for dealing with inbred populations so that we don't over-predict your relationship, and it still doesn't work great, but it works pretty well. I mean, at this point, all my second cousins are really my second cousins. Most of the people that we call my third cousins I know, but I have other people that I have enough DNA in common with to be third cousins with, but I don't know who they are. And I'm a genealogist, so I should know them. What that means is that, for all I know, those people are double cousins to me. A fifth cousin and a seventh cousin, and the amount of accumulated DNA just happens to be a little bit greater. And so that's kind of a challenge in this sphere. Okay. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I want to.
You're tentatively raising your hand?
Because I'm trying to do the math in my head. Now, I want to ask you about the thing with the lack of a more sophisticated word, inbreeding.
Yeah.
Which many Jews back when, because they were from, say, towns or villages and pueblos, and naturally, and the families were so large, there's a tremendous amount of inbreeding.
Correct.
And I wanted to know how that, very similar to this question, how that skews the differences from seeing a first or fifth or 10th cousin or whatever.
Right. Well, it really doesn't cause an issue on the, I would say, on the first cousin level for us to do the predictions. What it does is kind of down in the weeds in the third or fourth cousin level, we tend to have people who have more DNA in common than we would typically predict, and so they get kind of predicted up. So we'll tend to think that they're third cousins when they're not. Of course, the bigger effect of what you're talking about was the elevation in the percentage or the likelihood of Jewish genetic diseases, which is not an issue that we should treat lightly. There are 21 or 22 Ashkenazi genetic diseases that essentially are held within our population because we have married within, have large families, and married within, and so we tended to accumulate those percentages. The interesting thing from a heredity standpoint is that if we can find a mutation that is found among Jewish populations, and then we start finding it among non-Jewish populations, we can kind of get a clue. For example, the BRCA, the breast cancer gene, at one point it was referred to as an Ashkenazi disease, but that's not true. The scientists are now using time coalescence studies to show that that mutation likely happened in the Middle East about 4,500 years ago, which means it's not only found among Ashkenazim, who may have just been lucky enough to pass through the eye of the needle, meaning the Crusades and the Black Death, and survive, and maybe just because of luck, bad luck, a higher percentage of people with that mutation just happen to to survive, and then they married. However, it's also found in a little pueblo in New Mexico, and it's the same mutation that we have, which pretty much goes to show that those folks, even though they've been Catholic for 500 years, what they've been doing is they've been marrying within the 3 or 4 little villages where we know those people, and therefore they're safe. And that was kind of a code word in northern Mexico for saying he's a Judío, and it's okay. Okay. So there we go. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
A lot of the work that Archie has been doing has been helping a lot of the work that I've been involved in. The work is to bring people back to the Jewish faith. He mentioned to you some of the Spanish people, Bertha Sanchez, who, if I'm not mistaken, she was recognized as a returning Jew.
Correct.
Which is the first time a Bet Din.
First time.
First time, I think it was Geneva, right? The authorized Bet Din in Geneva recognized her with